What do you say we start off today's show with a fun fact? Did you know that despite only playing in 2 games so far this season, Cooper Kupp is only 23 points away from being inside the top 24 overall wide receivers after 6 weeks? That's right, today we're going to be talking about our starts and sits for the wide receiver position for Week 7 fantasy football, and I hope you're ready for here today. Now, we all know that we got a lot of teams on bye this week, right? 6 teams not playing this week, so that means we're going to be without a few big-name weekly starters, guys like Adam Thielen, Jamar Chase, CeeDee Lamb, Nico Collins even not going to be available to you this week. So let's go ahead and see if we can find a few guys that would be some solid replacements for some of our studs here in Week 7. Now, before I get into all the matchups, yes, there are timestamps down below, but I would love to just have a few moments here to talk to you guys. I am really passionate about continuing to try to make a difference here in this world. So if you watched this show a couple weeks ago, you saw that we partnered up with Compassion International. We're really trying to do our best to help children from all over the world. Well, last week I didn't put that in this video. I put it in the Friday tailgate video, and we saw very little results. So I got to bring it back to one of the big dogs right here in this wide receiver video. Now, so far, we've had 4 children sponsored, which is great. We're on our way to hitting our goal of 58 children sponsored by Super Bowl 58. But I would love nothing more than to see some of these children sponsored and taken from extreme poverty right here in the holiday season that is upcoming. So let's go ahead and meet last week's Compassion Kid of the Week, who is still looking to be sponsored. His name is Prosper. He's 7 years old. He currently lives in Ghana, and he's been waiting for a sponsor for what feels like forever, over 500 days. Is there anyone out there that is able to help this little guy change his life? If so, I have a link down below in the description to www.compassion.com/headliners. Then you can go on there, you can search for him by his child ID. Maybe he's already been sponsored. If so, that's great. There are still thousands of other children on that website that we can make a difference and try to help. I truly believe that we've built a community here that can change the world one child at a time. So once again, it's www.compassion.com/headliners. There are links down below in the description. If you already sponsor a child through Compassion, which I know there are a lot of you because I've seen the comments, leave that comment once again on this video here. A lot of people kind of on the fence, and it's comments like that that can really help convince people that Compassion is a great company to work with. But thank you so much for allowing me a couple seconds there to bring that up once again. But now let's talk some football. I know that's why you all came to this video in the first place. We're going to kick it off Thursday night with the New Orleans Saints and Jacksonville Jaguars. And let's go ahead and just kick it off right here with Jacksonville, okay? Because really not a lot has changed over the past couple of weeks. Christian Kirk remains the safer option week in and week out, but now both Calvin Ridley and Christian Kirk are averaging over 10 fantasy points per game. Their production is really a lot closer on the season than many people realize. The problem is Calvin Ridley's gotten the bulk of his in like 2 games, where Christian Kirk is a little bit more consistent weekly. There's just not enough touchdowns in this offense to make up the difference for only getting 5 receptions a week. But now they go up against New Orleans, and they allow 26.1 fantasy points per game, and we just saw them limit the likes of Nico Collins last week. All eyes, though, if we're being completely honest, are going to be on Trevor Lawrence, who suffered a minor knee sprain in Week 6 and may not practice a whole lot this week leading up to the game. Now, all reports are saying that he's going to be okay, but it's definitely something to pay attention to, especially with a Thursday night game here, a short week for the Jags. With all the unknown limitations to Trevor Lawrence at this time, you have to assume there's going to be some risk with his starting wide receivers. Kirk still remains the safer option. Ridley really reliant on scoring a touchdown to be a better fantasy option. I hate Thursday games because you never know how they're going to go. We have to know that with this offense, they've improved the past couple weeks, but they're not quite where they need to be, and we need Trevor Lawrence to be 100%. Now, for their opponents, the New Orleans Saints, you got Chris Olave, you got Michael Thomas, you got Rashid Shaheed, and man, it was great to see Chris Olave return to double-digit targets after weeks 4 and 5, absolute grossness that we saw out there on the field. What was great to see was Carr throw the ball 50 times last week, and Olave's yard per reception creeped back up to 13.5. Don't forget, the 2 prior weeks, it was sitting around 5 yards per reception. That isn't going to cut it. Now, a lot of people are going to want to consider Rashid Shaheed this week after they saw him score 17 fantasy points just last week. But the guy only had 2 receptions. There is nothing safe about needing a 50-yard touchdown each and every week to be fantasy viable. Now, for sure, that is something that we could see from him. We've already seen it a couple times this year, right? But it's not something we can rely upon weekly, and the volume just isn't there to make him safe. He's going to be a huge risk anytime you put him into your lineup. But now they're going up against Jacksonville, and they allow 30.8 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. That's 11th most on the season, and they are way easier to throw on than they are to run on. This offensive line is still hurting pretty hardcore, and the run game can't seem to get going, which means we're going to have to throw the ball more and more each week. Now, Michael Thomas, he hasn't really shown the ability to go out there and score over 10 fantasy points in any game this season. Rashid Shaheed hasn't shown to be anything really but big play dependent so far in this season. Chris Olave, he remains the most consistent option in this offense, and we always start those guys that average 10 targets per game, a la Chris Olave. If you're looking for a little bit of upside here, maybe you're dealing with a lot of bye weeks and you just need to take a stab at somebody, I don't hate Rashid Shaheed this week. Just know there's a lot of risk in starting him. All right, now let's move on to some Sunday football. Let's talk about the Detroit Lions and Baltimore Ravens. We'll start it off in Detroit. And I'm really interested to see what this passing game looks like with the running game being so banged up. Now, we know Amon-Ra, he is the most consistent option in this offense. That's not a shocker to anyone. He's averaging 16 fantasy points per game and has finished inside the top 12 at the position in 80% of the games he's played this season. But we did just see Jameson Williams flash a little bit of that big play upside just last week. Only 2 catches, 53 yards, and a touchdown, but the target share just isn't there weekly to make him a safer play. Both him and Josh Reynolds only saw 3 targets last week. Right now, it's all about Amon-Ra, and it's all about Sam Laporta in this passing offense. Now they get a matchup going up against Baltimore. They allow 23.7 fantasy points per game, 7th fewest in the league, but they do have multiple injuries right now in the secondary. When it comes to injuries in Detroit, we know we're not going to have David Montgomery. Jahmyr Gibbs could be back this week, but doesn't really matter. They don't use him that much anyway. And the secondary is banged up in Detroit as well. It's really hard right here to trust any wide receiver that's not named Amon-Ra St. Brown or hashtag Doomtar down below in the comment section. No one else sees consistent volume at the position. Jameson Williams, more of a weekly boom or bust play. Now, when he booms, he helps you win. The problem is you just never know when that big play is going to come. He doesn't see enough volume for us to really try to hope for it weekly. And for their opponents, it's really only about Zay Flowers, right? He's the only one worth talking about at the position for Baltimore. He's seen 8+ targets now in 4 of the 6 games he's played. He's had at least 5 receptions in 4 of the 6 games he's played, and has had 50+ yards receiving in 5 of the 6 games this season. Right now, there isn't another wide receiver on the roster that's had over 20 targets through 6 weeks. They just don't throw the ball enough to their wide receivers. Now, Detroit, they allow 29.6 fantasy points per game, 13th most in the league, and we already know that it's super difficult to run on Detroit, the #1 run defense right now in the NFL. When it comes to injuries there in Baltimore, most of them are going to be on the defensive side of the football, not affecting the passing game. But like we already know, the Lions have one of the best offenses in the NFL. And I just mentioned they're the #1 overall running defense in the NFL. Lamar and the Ravens are going to have to throw the ball this week. They don't throw it to anyone else besides Zay Flowers at the wide receiver position, so he's the guy I'm rolling with this week. How about we move on to Las Vegas and Chicago now? And this one's going to be a cluster, if you know what I'm talking about. For Las Vegas, what could happen here to Davante Adams and Jakobi Meyers if Jimmy G isn't able to play this week? Well, it's not going to be any better. I think I can tell you that because both of these guys were already top 20 overall wide receivers in fantasy football. Both of them are averaging over 6 receptions a game and over 14 fantasy points per game. Is it going to be Brian Hoyer? Is it going to be Aiden O'Connell? more than likely either one of them aren't going to be able to keep that pace with these wide receivers, at least not both of them. Now, Aiden O'Connell did lock on to Davante Adams in his start. In that game, 13 targets, 8 receptions, and 75 yards. A little bit more dink or dunk for Davante Adams. But now they're going against Chicago. They allow 29 fantasy points per game, which is right around league average, but all eyes are going to be on Jimmy G. Being that it's a back injury and that he actually went to the hospital after the game in week 6, it doesn't sound like something that's going to magically heal itself and have him be 100% in week 7. Now, we know that Davante Adams is basically a weekly must start, and we know he's going to see the bulk of the volume no matter who the quarterback is. When a backup quarterback comes in relief, you know they're looking for their top target to make their job a little bit easier. Obviously, y'all know I love myself some Jakobi Meyers, and he's earned the right to really get a similar target share in this offense. But if we're talking about safety right now, I don't know if we can trust both of these guys with a backup quarterback, and Davante Adams gets the slight edge. Their opponent in Chicago, it's DJ Moore. And for DJ Moore, we already know he isn't going to have his quarterback. Justin Fields has already been ruled doubtful and could miss multiple weeks. So now we have to turn to Tyson Bagent and really hope that he locks on to DJ Moore, similar to what could happen in Las Vegas. Now, after Bagent took over last week, Moore was his most commonly targeted wide receiver. But you have to think that this is still going to limit the potential ceiling of DJ Moore each and every week. Going to need a lot more yards after the catch, if you know what I mean. I don't expect very many deep shots down the field, but at least we know that DJ Moore possesses that potential to take a 5-yard slant 85 yards down the field. He's great with yards after the catch. As of right now, he's averaging the highest yards after the catch per reception in his career since 2018. Now they're going up against Las Vegas. They allow 25.2 fantasy points per game. Actually, not too bad. 10th fewest in the NFL. We're really hoping that Roschon Johnson comes back to help this running game a little bit, take a little bit of that pressure off of Tyson Bagent. Could also open up some more opportunities down the field for DJ Moore until we can get Justin Fields back. Moore is going to take a huge hit right now, and until we see what Tyson Bagent can do. I mean, let's be realistic. Nobody probably even knew who Tyson Bagent was until last week. Moore is going to go from like a top 12 option to like a top 25 to 30 option, which absolutely sucks since he helped people win multiple weeks here over the last couple weeks of the season. Now let's go down to Cleveland and Indianapolis. We'll start off in Cleveland, and I missed on Amari Cooper last week. Full disclosure, I missed. I didn't like Amari Cooper last week. I didn't like him playing with a backup quarterback against the San Francisco defense in the rain. And the dude still went out and had 8 targets, 4 receptions for 108 yards, 1 really big play. It wasn't a huge day overall. He was wide receiver 20. And for right now, he's sitting at wide receiver 39 overall on the season. Now, while Cooper is the only wide receiver that's really worth considering in Cleveland, it isn't some weekly high-end option without Deshaun Watson. Now, with Watson in the lineup, Amari Cooper's averaging right around 13 fantasy points per game. Without Watson, averaging right around 7.5 fantasy points per game. Now they're going up against Indianapolis, though. They allow 29.5 fantasy points per game to wide receivers, but this one really comes down to the availability of Deshaun Watson, whether he plays or he doesn't. And we already know that's been a super weird situation. He's on his way back. He's weeks away. He's medically cleared. He can't practice. Nobody has any idea what the hell's going on in Cleveland, and until we find more information, it's going to make Amari Cooper a little bit less reliable. Now, he's going to have flex value this week in a good matchup for sure, but the ceiling just may not be as high if we don't have Deshaun Watson. Now, for their opponents in Indianapolis, we got Michael Pittman and Josh Downs, and for the first week in what seems to be many upcoming weeks, we did not see Gardner Minshew lock on to Josh Downs the way that we had seen him do earlier in the season. He really wanted and needed to go down the field a little bit more this past week to Michael Pittman. Pittman is now the overall wide receiver 17 in fantasy football and now has 3 games with 12 plus fantasy points on the season. He's also averaging 10 targets a game. And what do we do with wide receivers that average 10 targets per game? Yep, you guys have been paying attention. I know you have. You start wide receivers that average 10 targets per week. Now they're going against Cleveland, though, and that's not enticing, right? They allow only 14.3 fantasy points per game, which is fewest in the league. We know that Alec Pierce is banged up. We know that tight end Kylan Granson is banged up. They're both questionable to play, and now it sounds like we may not have Anthony Richardson back until next season. He may opt for surgery and be done the rest of the year. Now, Pittman has 3 games this season with less than 10 fantasy points, and this game kind of gives me similar vibes. But Downs and Pittman should both see easily 8+ targets in this game, and it's going to take a big play for one of them to put up a big fantasy day. Now, with injuries and bye weeks, I don't think we can afford to sit a wide receiver that averages 10 targets per game, so I still have Michael Pittman slightly higher than Josh Downs this week. How about we now go down to New England for the Buffalo Bills, New England Patriots. We'll start off with Buffalo, and Stefon Diggs continues to show why he was worth every penny as a early round fantasy football pick. 10+ fantasy points in every game this season, 20+ fantasy points in 3 of the 6 games so far, the overall wide receiver 2 behind only Tyreek Hill. Now, unfortunately, Gabe Davis couldn't keep that hot streak going in week 6. He only had 4 targets, 3 receptions, 21 yards, and no touchdowns against the New York Giants, which was his worst game since week 1. Now going up against New England, they allow 26.7 fantasy points per game, but we're really watching Josh Allen closely here. He suffered a minor shoulder injury in week 6. He finished the game, but didn't really look great down the stretch. We also know that Dalton Kincaid is questionable because he's still in the concussion protocol. This isn't a great matchup for Gabe Davis, if I'm being completely honest either. He's still 100% going to be totally touchdown dependent. He thrived off great matchups in weeks 2 through 5, where they faced the likes of Las Vegas, Washington, Miami, and Jacksonville. This matchup right here is going to be way more risky for him, and he's going to be a Verge top 30 pick this week. Now, for their opponents in New England, no. I'm just not interested, okay? No wide receiver is averaging over 5 receptions per game. Only Kendrick Bourne is remotely close to averaging 10 fantasy points per week, but that number is severely inflated due to what he did back in week 1. He's already had 4 games this season with sub 7 fantasy points per game. We have no idea what lies ahead for this quarterback situation in New York either. Is it Tyrod Taylor? Is Daniel Jones ready to go? Doesn't matter. Neither one of them right now a great option going up against Buffalo, who allows 26.1 fantasy points per game. We know Juju is banged up. Wide receiver Demario Douglas, he's questionable as well. Just a crazy low ceiling here with all these wide receivers that I am not interested in. Pass, no thank you, not gonna do it in week 7. How about we go down to New York now for the Giants and the Washington Commandos? And man, I was so glad to see that Sam Howell actually remembered that Terry McLaurin was on his team last week. McLaurin saw a season-high 11 targets, which he turned into 6 receptions for 81 yards. However, still only has 1 touchdown on the season. Curtis Samuel right now continues to be the safest option, the red zone option. He now has touchdowns in 3 straight games and is averaging over 10 fantasy points per contest on the season, after scoring 12+ fantasy points in 3 straight games. Not huge volume though going to Samuel. He's averaging right around 6 targets per game, but they're definitely high value targets that he's seen. Now they're going up against the Giants. They allow the 12th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers at 30.2 per contest. No new injuries here in Washington. Jahan Dotson is really an afterthought in this offense right now. He's not involved at all. Sam Howell is playing pretty well. Both Terry McLaurin and Curtis Samuel going to be top 30 options for us here this week. For their opponents in New York, there's nothing to see here, unless you're looking for a wide receiver that averages sub 7 points per game on an offense that just can't score points. Sure, the matchup is great, but the quarterback play in New York isn't. The offensive line is a mess. They're all injured right now. There's really no one that I'm considering for the New York Giants in fantasy football. Which will now take us down to Tampa Bay for the Buccaneers and the Falcons. We'll start off in Atlanta, and Drake London is finally starting to be utilized weekly in this offense, which is great to see. He now has scored 10+ fantasy points in 3 straight ball games, just had his first double-digit target game game of the season and his first 100-yard receiving game of 2023. And that volume is going to have to continue since this isn't an offense that's going to put up a ton of passing touchdowns. We need volume if we're not going to get touchdowns. Now they're going up against Tampa Bay. They allow 31.8 fantasy points per game, 8th most in the league to opposing wide receivers. We know this passing game in Atlanta overall, fairly healthy. Still somewhat matchup dependent is Drake London, though. He isn't someone that we can just throw out there in every single matchup and expect a huge game. He has benefited here recently by playing the likes of Washington and Jacksonville over the last 3 weeks, but Tampa Bay has given up plenty of points to opposing wide receivers, so Drake London isn't a bad option this week. His opponent on the other side of the football, we got Mike Evans, we got Chris Godwin there of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and now would be a great time to get that Mike Evans back that we saw the first 3 weeks of the season. If you take away the game in week 4 when he got hurt in the first half of that game, he's had 10 targets in 3 of the 4 games so far that he's played in. Godwin, on the other hand, only saw 10 plus targets in the game in which Mike Evans got hurt and has only had 1 game all year long where he scored at least 10 fantasy points, a lot less productive overall than Mike Evans. But now they're going against Atlanta, and Atlanta is great against opposing wide receivers. They allow only 22.4 fantasy points per game, 5th fewest in the league, and they have been limiting teams' #1 wide receiver options for multiple weeks this season. Now, when it comes to injuries, nothing really new. We expect Mike Evans to be a little bit closer to 100%. Remember, last week, he was coming off of a hamstring injury. Now, in a matchup like this, I don't know if I can label either one of these guys as some low-risk option for week 7. If I had to take a chance on one, it's still going to be Mike Evans. He is the #1 target of Baker Mayfield. He's averaging the most targets per game, and we've seen him make multiple big plays already here in 2023. He's just the more consistent option right now. What about the Los Angeles Rams and Pittsburgh Steelers that started off in Pittsburgh? And for the Steelers, they're coming off their bye week, so they had an extra week to prep for this game. But the bigger question is, do they get back Diontae Johnson to this offense? He suffered a hamstring injury back in week 1 and is scheduled to come off the IR at any time. They for sure need him because they could not find a way to utilize George Pickens each and every week. Listen to this. George Pickens had over 125 yards receiving and a touchdown in each of the 2 games that he saw 10 targets in Diontae Johnson's absence. The problem was they couldn't even get him 10 targets each and every game. If I have a wide receiver that's putting up that type of numbers, you better believe I'm finding a way to get him the ball, and only had 2 games since week 1 with 10 targets. Something just doesn't sound right there in this offense, especially since they're settling for just running Najee Harris up the middle for 3 yards at a pop. I mean, you really would have expected more volume, being that Diontae Johnson is a volume type guy, just going the way of George Pickens, and we just didn't see it consistently. Now they're going up against the Rams, who allow 21.4 fantasy points per game, 3rd fewest to wide receivers. Pittsburgh could also be getting back Pat Freiermuth, which would be a boost to their offense as well. We're really waiting to see if Diontae Johnson is not only activated off the IR, but active for this game. Even if he is, you have to think he's going to see some sort of reduced workload coming off of a hamstring injury. As of right now, George Pickens going to be slightly safer, the higher ranked of the 2, but it's not going to be an easy matchup regardless. Their opponents, the Los Angeles Rams, and okay, I guess we found out what the floor is for Puka, right? Only 7 targets, 4 receptions, and 26 yards in week 6 against Arizona. Cooper Kupp, on the other hand, dominated like usual. 9 targets, 7 receptions, 148 yards, and a touchdown. But this really wasn't a Puka issue. This wasn't that Cooper Kupp is just taking back over. No, they just didn't have to throw the ball very much to beat Arizona. Stafford only threw the ball 24 times in week 6. Prior to week 6, they were averaging 40 pass attempts per game. That's a lot of missed opportunity for Puka right there. Now they're going up against Pittsburgh. They allow 35.6 fantasy points per game to wide receivers. That's 4th most in the NFL. We know the running game is banged up in Los Angeles as well. No Kyren Williams, no Ronnie Rivers. But while Cooper Kupp has ascended back up to the top of Mount wide receiver Rushmore, we have to look at Puka a little bit differently, right? Is he going to be a top 12 option each and every week? Probably not. He's going to be a top 24 option, though, each week in this offense, and he's still very much so fantasy startable. Now let's go out to Seattle. Let's talk about the Arizona Cardinals and Seattle Seahawks. For Arizona, it's really only Marquise Hollywood Brown, and we're really hoping that this turns into some type of divisional shootout, right? Because both of these teams allow over 32 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Right now, Hollywood, he's wide receiver 16 overall, averaging 11.5 fantasy points per game, and has had 13 plus fantasy points in 4 of the last 5 games he's played. Most importantly, though, he's also seen 10 plus targets in 4 of the last 5 contests as well, and has 3 touchdowns on the season. The bad part of that is he's only hauled in 54.7% of his targets, and we need that number to be a little bit more closer to the 70 range. Remember, not all targets are created equal. We want and need more catchable targets to Hollywood Brown. Like I said, though, going up against Seattle, they allow 38 fantasy points per game, and that's tied for most in the NFL to opposing wide receivers. No new injuries here of any concern in the passing game, but this Seattle defense has actually been playing a little bit better here over their last 2 games. But one of those games came against the Giants, and they super suck, and that's definitely going to skew the numbers just a little bit. In a great matchup for a team that's probably going to be losing, trailing, and throwing the ball once again, here's to another 10-target game for Marquise Hollywood Brown. On the other side of the field, you got DK Metcalf, you got Tyler Lockett, and DK right now, he's starting to look a little bit pissed, and deservedly so. He's wide open all over the field, and Geno just can't seem to find him consistently. Now, DK does need to maybe tone it down a notch. He doesn't need to be taking it all out on his opponents. No reason to Hulk smash a dude randomly on the field, right? But the volume we know is going to continue to be there for him weekly and give him those opportunities at those big plays. I'm kind of hoping that some of that visual frustration we've seen over the past couple weeks leads to him being force-fed some targets to get him going once again in this offense. As for Tyler Lockett, he hasn't had a touchdown since week 2, but he has seen at least 6 plus targets in 4 of his 5 games. Now, going up against Arizona, they allow 32.5 fantasy points per contest, and they have been absolutely torched the past 3 weeks by Brandon Ayuk, Jamar Chase, and Cooper Kupp in the secondary. We already know the offensive line here in Seattle, it's in shambles. With Arizona being so susceptible to touchdowns here as of late, you have to think that both of these guys have an opportunity to find the end zone in week 7. How about we go down to Denver now for the Broncos and the Green Bay Packers? We'll start it off with Green Bay, who's coming off their bye week and getting a great matchup. Denver has been basically the laughingstock of the league for most of the year, and the Packers need a get-right game, right? Because that game that we saw prior to the bye week was downright crappy. Now, in that game prior to the bye, we saw Christian Watson's role increase a little bit in this offense. Remember, he was coming back off of injury, so you have to think that he should be 100% healthy here post-bye. But what's crazy is how Green Bay chose to downright ignore Romeo Doubs in week 5. You have to think that changes to some extent this week as well. Now, Denver, they allow right around 29 fantasy points per game, but they were for sure helped out in that department last week by the wide receivers of the Kansas City Chiefs, and the week prior to that by the New York Jets. Those numbers are a little bit skewed, and Denver allows more points than really a lot of people may expect. Could get Aaron Jones back this week, which is absolutely great. Could be the first time this season that the entire offense is healthy and together on the field at the same time. I like this more so because they're coming off of the bye week, if I'm being completely honest. They had an extra week to prepare for this matchup. Not going to be some highly ranked wide receiver options, but I do feel like both Christian Watson and Romeo Doubs could find their way into some fantasy lineups here in week 7. Now, for their opponents, I can't really say the same thing for the wide receivers of the Denver Broncos. You got Jerry Jeudy, who's out there being called out by another grown man on national television, and all he could do is go out and get 3 catches for 14 yards. Sutton, who's been playing absolutely great, hasn't gotten over 6 targets in a game since week 3. They need to give Courtland Sutton more opportunities in this offense, because when they do, he makes plays. When they finally gave him a chance, he made a huge, ridiculous contested catch in the end zone in that game last week against Kansas City for a touchdown. Now they're going up against Green Bay, though, and they allow the 9th fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers at only 24.8 per game. No other major injuries here in the passing game, but this is going to be a tough matchup against a team who's coming off their bye week. Courtland Sutton can't get consistent volume, and more than likely he's going to draw Jair Alexander of the Green Bay Packers. Jeudy, I guess he's still more worried about dancing behind Steve Smith on TV None of these guys are going to be safe, but if I had to choose one, it's still Courtland Sutton. How about we now go down to Kansas City for the Chiefs and the Chargers? Let's talk about Keenan Allen and Josh Palmer first of the Los Angeles Chargers. Right now, Keenan Allen is all the way up to wide receiver 4 overall. And had he connected on that one deep ball from Justin Herbert that they just missed in week 6, he's probably the wide receiver 2 overall, but I mean, wide receiver 4 ain't bad, right? He's got 4 touchdowns over his last 4 games played, 10 plus targets now in 3 of his last 4. Quentin Johnston, he just continues to not have a role in this offense. He cannot get open down the field. Josh Palmer came into this game limited with a groin injury and still looked pretty freaking good. Better than Quentin Johnston did, and he's fully healthy. That was his 3rd straight game with 60 plus yards receiving for Josh Palmer, but he only has 1 touchdown on the season. Kansas City continues to play tough defense though, allowing only 23.8 fantasy points per game, 8th fewest in the league. Most of the injuries in LA on the defensive side of the football, but there is no way that you can ever sit Keenan Allen regardless of the matchup. Palmer, though, going to be a little bit more big play dependent. If he doesn't score a touchdown this week, he could hurt your team, and he's going to be somebody that I really only consider in those deeper leagues, those 3 wide receiver leagues, those leagues that start like 3 flex plays. Then I'll consider Josh Palmer, but this isn't the greatest of matchup for these guys. When we talk about Kansas City, do you ever just have like a gut feeling? Like just something telling you something that you really don't understand why? That's what I'm going through right now with Rashee Rice in this game. I really have no other reason for it beside the fact that it's a home game in Kansas City in a matchup against a team that allows a butt ton of points to opposing wide receivers. And as of late, Rashee Rice has looked like the best wide receiver option in Kansas City. Now, pass volume doesn't really support this in any way. He's only had over 5 targets in 1 game all season and hasn't had over 5 receptions in a game yet this year, but has only had 5 receptions 1 time. But like I said, this matchup is great. The Chargers allow over 38 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, tied for most in the NFL, and we just saw CeeDee Lamb eat against this secondary last week. But I also see the injury to Justin Watson as being an opportunity for Rashee Rice. I mean, Justin Watson was their leading receiver through the first 6 weeks of the season. Now, I know that's not saying very much, but it is definitely a boost to Rashee Rice. Now, this isn't some, Jake just said Rashee Rice is some must start here in week 6. No, it's just one of those matchups that I look at and it screams potential breakout. But there is nothing safe about starting a wide receiver in Kansas City. The only guys we really look at weekly are going to be like Kelsey and Pacheco. I just got a feeling about Rashee Rice this week, which will then take us down to Philadelphia for the Miami Dolphins, the Philadelphia Eagles, my Manscaped matchup of the week. That's right, it may sound crazy, but it's already mid-October, and Christmas is right around the corner and will be here before you know it. And ladies, right now is the time for you to find something special for that man in your life. Go over to manscaped.com, find something for him. Maybe he doesn't even think he needs anything from there, but maybe you just need to drop some subtle hints. Just be sure to get it at a discount. Use the promo code HEADLINERS at checkout for 20% off and free shipping. If you're gonna get a present, get a little bit of a discount on it as well. But for this matchup, kind of a no-brainer, right? We know we start Tyreek Hill each and every week. He's pretty good, right? I mean, he's got 814 yards receiving in only 6 games this season. The dude is really going for that 2,000-yard mark. But Jalen Waddle is starting to bounce back a little bit as well. Now has back-to-back games with a touchdown, back-to-back games with 9+ targets, and is now averaging over 10 fantasy points per game. Now, he's slowly working his way back up the wide receiver ranks. I know a lot of people were disappointed with the way he started the season, but you gotta remember, he is capable of that one big game. And that one big game is gonna boost him right back up to the pace he was at last season as well. There's a great opportunity for that to happen this week too, going against Philadelphia, who allows 34.1 fantasy points per game, 6th most in the league. Overall, this team is very healthy. You have to look for ways to get pieces of a top NFL offense into your fantasy lineup. This Miami offense is almost number 1 in every offensive category. Those are the guys you have to target. You want a piece of that offense in your lineup every week if you can. Because I don't care if it's the quarterback position, the running back position, or the wide receiver position, they all have the opportunity to help win you a matchup basically by themselves. For their opponents, you got the Philadelphia Eagles. And A.J. Brown is about as must-start as it gets, right? 4 straight games over 125 yards receiving, averaging 10 targets per game. Still waiting for a little bit more of those touchdowns to show up for us. Only has 2 on the season, but with the amount of volume he's seen here as of late, it's only a matter of time. The bigger disappointment is DeVonta Smith in this offense. He led this team for the first 2 weeks of the season. A.J. Brown then got frustrated, and we really haven't seen DeVonta Smith since. Since week 2, DeVonta Smith has no touchdowns and hasn't had over 80 yards receiving in a game. Not to mention Dallas Goedert, because right now I'm feeling kind of fancy, is taking away a lot of that upside that we saw from Smith earlier in the season as well. Now they're going up against Miami. They allow 31 fantasy points per game, 10th most in the league. Most of their injuries are on defense as well, so this offense still pretty much full force. I do want to make a note, though, that DeVonta Smith last week just saw a season high in targets with 11. So he isn't forgotten in this offense. They really want to try to find a way to get him going once again, but he is definitely going to be the riskier of the 2 options, hoping this kind of turns into a shootout a little bit back and forth with Miami, where both of these guys could benefit. For everybody that wants to ask about Julio Jones, no, it's not 2019 anymore. The guy hasn't done anything in forever. He was signed to a practice squad. I'm really not that interested. I'm still taking A.J. Brown and DeVonta Smith, even once Julio is activated or added to the main roster, whatever it is. I know we were desperate for some headlines. We saw Julio Jones' name and we all got excited. But like I said, he ain't been nothing since pre-COVID. Okay, so it's been a while. I'm not concerned about him as of right now. Now let's go down to the San Francisco 49ers and Minnesota Vikings. And the biggest question here has to be the availability of Deebo Samuel, who was injured in week 6 with a shoulder injury. This team, though, they've been without Deebo quite a bit in the past, and they've been just fine. We already know that when it comes to the wide receiver 1 option on this team, it's still Brandon Ayuk. He's averaging 5 catches for 90 yards a game, and his floor has never been safer. But the touchdowns haven't really been there. He hasn't had one in 4 weeks. Now, if Deebo were to sit in this ballgame, this could definitely be the week that Brandon Ayuk finds the end zone once again. Because going up against Minnesota, they allow the 5th most fantasy points to opposing wide receivers at 34.9. Plus, we also know that CMC is banged up as well and dealing with an oblique injury. We could be seeing a ton of Brandon Ayuk and George Kittle if we do not have Deebo Samuel and Christian McCaffrey in this ballgame. Now, obviously, we're not going to make assumptions on whether or not they're going to play this week or not. We're going to pay attention to all the practice reports and then be sure to stay tuned on Friday when the doc drops his injury update video. But as of right now, I am a full go on Brandon Ayuk and we're waiting everywhere else. If Deebo were to play, he's going to be a lot lower in my rankings and a lot more of a risky start due to playing with an injury. But now we'll go down to Minnesota. And does anyone else out there just miss Justin Jefferson yet? I know I do for sure 100%. I mean, we had Jordan Addison and KJ Osborne. They weren't horrible, but they didn't really get a boost in volume either. No one really did in this offense. They just threw the ball a lot less, which is really weird. It's not like the run game was working last week. We had Alexander Mattison averaging a whopping 2.4 yards per carry, and the game was close for all 4 quarters. So it's kind of concerning that they didn't choose to throw the ball more. And now they get to go up against San Francisco, who allows 26.8 fantasy points per game, but they are a lot easier to throw on than they are to run on, which is great. However, nothing is easy against San Francisco, and this offensive line is keeping Kirk Cousins running for his life. How do you think that's going to go against the pass rush of the San Francisco 49ers? Now, with all that being said, neither one of these guys can be looked at as some low-risk option this week. The matchup is just going to be super tough. Now, you have to think that the best thing in this matchup would be for San Francisco to get an early lead and force Kirk Cousins to have to throw the ball more all 4 quarters. But I'm worried about that pass rush of the San Francisco 49ers, like I mentioned. Jordan Addison has been getting weekly looks at a red zone opportunity, a deep ball opportunity, and as of right now, he'll still remain slightly higher in my rankings than KJ Osborne, but neither one of these guys is going to be ranked overly high. All right, that's going to do it for my Week 7 starts and sits for the wide receiver position. Hopefully, I was able to give you a little bit of information. Don't forget, if you're trying to make some tough decisions in your lineup, our rankings will drop Thursday morning prior to the Thursday night football game, so everybody can lock in their lineups before kickoff of that game. But I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully, you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.